because we started late, we'll move fast to the Q&A section. Please ask questions and name the speaker you're referring to. Please.
My question is a broad one, but it starts from the excellent presentations that we had. Broadly speaking, it's how do we go from there? And what I mean by that is to say now we have a good, and I think we all share this assessment, a good IAEA report, which does expose almost publicly, as we know the report is formally classified, but it does expose publicly the aims and extent of Iranian nuclear advances. So how do we fulfill, I think, two things. One is a strategic objective, that is the rollback of the Iranian nuclear program, and the second is a tactical objective, which is to how do we open a debate in the Iranian leadership on the on their decision to go further. I think at the moment the Iranian leadership still believes it can have the cake and eat it, and probably sleep with the cooker and do everything else. I think we need to really clearly look at what are the options there. And I think there it might be a bit misleading, and I turn that into a question, to not put together all, instead of looking at options, military option, negotiations, sanctions, deterrence. In fact, we are talking about a mix of everything. I think the threat of the military option is necessary to make the negotiation go forward. I think the deterrence makes the nuclear option in Iran less relevant, and somehow the sanctions are necessary. The threat of sanctions and the sanctions themselves have already proved some efficiency in convincing the Iranian leadership to think through this. So what is the right balance, is the way I would frame the question, in terms of doing the threatening bit about the military option is on the table, and there I'm not sure it should be only Israeli or Israeli American. I think it's interesting to see that there might be a broader coalition. And the second thing is what sort of face-saving negotiation. So I'll turn to the table now. Thank you.
Another one, Shlomo.
I would like to allude to a point that was made by Dr. Barel in his excellent presentation. You refer to the connection or the linkage between regime change and the Iranian nuclear program, and you actually repeated the argument that is made many times that there is no real connection because everyone in Iran supports the Iranian nuclear program. But I have a problem with this argument because, of course, everyone supports the nuclear program, assuming that it is costless. The real question is not whether you support your country having nuclear weapons. I am willing to bet that you will ask citizens of any state on the globe, excluding the Western European countries that were indoctrinated against nuclear weapons for a long time, you will ask them the following question. The other guy has a nuclear weapon. Do you think your states should have a nuclear weapon? They will all say yes. That is not the right question. The right question is, how much are you willing to pay for that? And here I see a clear difference between the present regime in Iran and a possible other regime in Iran. Because the real question is the new regime willing to continue the isolation of Iran for the nuclear program? And I think that it's quite probable that the answer will be no. Thank you.
Let me just add to that one sentence, to Tzvi Bar-El. It's not only the question of the cost, there's also a question of how threatening the regime is. In other words, nuclear weapons exist in context. And if the context is less threatening, then the threat value of the nuclear weapons go way down. So in that sense as well, that's not really the relevant question whether everyone supports it. We know everyone supports the nuclear program. But if you're not threatening your neighbors with hegemonic ambitions or other things, then nuclear programs take on different meanings.
Please.
Thank you. A question for Professor Kam. I'm interested that you seem to have rehearsed, when discussing the military option, this binary idea that it's either Israel or the United States. As recently as last week, Yuval Steinitz, who's a member of the Forum of Eight, spoke about European intervention as well as American intervention being the Israeli ideal rather than Israeli intervention. There's been some posturing by the Brits, by the French, a recent report in a British newspaper. Are you so convinced that only the Americans or the Israelis can do it? Is the idea of European intervention, is that a chimera? And the second question for Professors Sidhu and Dr. Bar-El, could you elaborate on what the grand bargain would be? I'm not sure the Iranians are as isolated as people say they are. I'm not sure they're as in need of a bargain as people say they are. I'm not sure they're even that interested in engagement with the United States. Certainly not with Israel. So what would the bargain look like? What would the respect look like that Dr. Bar-El spoke of?
No.
I have two short questions to Paul and Ephraim regarding the military option. I mean, one would be, and I think you indicated that, a surgical strike could be also used to put pressure to the Iranians to come back to the negotiation table. So, I mean, it's not either or. It's part of coercing them to be more cooperative. I mean, theoretically speaking, whether this would work out, this is a totally different question. But I think it goes along the line Camille said. So don't make an either or. It could be a tool to coerce them to come back to the negotiation table. It's very risky, but it's theoretically possible. To Ephraim, I mean, until a couple of months ago, I would have shared your concerns about Iranian retaliatory measurements. I'm not quite sure whether with the Arab whatever, this is still the case. I mean, if Syria gets out of their hands, why should a new Syrian government escalate for the Iranians? Why should Hezbollah, basically, who has a very firm position now in Lebanon, of course Iranian influence, but it's becoming more and more a national party in Lebanon, why should they risk an Israeli intervention once again, which would be totally different from the last one, for the sake of the Iranian cause? The same probably is true for Hamas. Maybe the Iranians could cause some trouble in the Gulf. Yeah, I wouldn't rule that out. The U.S. is withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan. So the old idea that if the U.S. participates in such strikes, the Iranians have more or less 50,000 hostages next door, in a couple of months is no longer true. So I would question whether Iran is really able to escalate horizontally in case that someone would conduct surgical strikes or a full-fledged war against the Iranian leadership. And the last question, and then I stop here, is could we see a much more tougher becoming U.S. President Obama the closer he gets to the election? Because, I mean, his domestic record is extremely poor. He can't score on that card. So maybe the only card he can score is taking the troops out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan, being tough on Iran, including the military option. And the Republicans are playing on that. I mean, Mitt Romney, if you re-elect Obama, Iran will go nuclear. With me, it won't go. So could we see a change in U.S. policy? And then they don't care a damn about a Security Council mandate or not. It's just for domestic purposes to show toughness vis-à-vis Iran.
Okay, we'll stop the questions here. Please, we'll start with Frank.
Let me refer to two of the questions referred to the military option. First, I believe it can be done, that it can be done. Am I sure? No, I'm not, because I don't have the answers to some of the questions that I raised before, because they are based on classified material, and I don't read any longer classified material. So I assume that my answer is yes, but with some reservation because, as I said, I don't have the answer to this question. I also believe that there is no third candidate to take part in such an operation beyond the possible American and/or Israeli participation. I think that most of the other countries, European governments, might either criticize it, but for sure they're not going to take part in it. There is no chance, I think. And I think eventually, if such an operation will be successful, they will benefit from it. They will use it, as they did following the Israeli attack on the Iraqi plant 30 years ago. So this might be my answer short answer regarding the meaning of this military operation. Then the other question was what about the Iranian response? First of all, I'm confident Iran will respond. Iran cannot allow itself not to respond. And Iran is saying it explicitly, and I believe the Iranians in this case. And I assume that they will use whatever they can do, especially if the other side will be Israel. I'm less sure about hitting American targets because, as I said before, to play with superpowers is a different game. But I'm sure that as long as they are Israelis targets, they'll do whatever they can do. And ballistic missiles, they don't have to ask permission of anybody. I think they will try to use Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has a huge arsenal of rockets today, much larger than it was 5 or 6 years ago. I am less sure about Hamas. Hamas is not obeying Iranian orders. Hamas is a different kind of organization. Hamas might be more careful. I'm also not absolutely sure about Hezbollah, because Hezbollah has to take into account that Israel will try to complete what has not done 5 years ago. So it can be. But I think at the bottom line, one has to take into account that this is going to be the kind of Iranian response. Finally, I want to say I agree with the sense of your comment, because I believe that whatever the Iranians might do, using ballistic missile, terrorism, Hezbollah, is not a kind of strategic answer. It's not going to change the strategic situation, in part because they have their own reservation, especially with regard to the United States, to some extent with regard to Israel, also because we do have some partial answer to this kind of operations against Hezbollah, against Hamas, against Iran itself. And I think the outcome will not be so dramatic as one might expect. Thank you.
Please, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Kami, starting with your observation, I think this is probably the way that we should think about that going forward. Until now, I think there's been three clear approaches or cases of countries rolling back their nuclear weapon programs. Right. The first was South Africa. Regime change was one way, but it was an internal sort of dimension, approach that went through. Second was Iraq. Iraq is probably the only example we have of a military operation to disarm. Of course, it helped that he walked into Kuwait and, facilitated, etc. And, that this is a mistake that others may not make. But, the question that we have to ask is, sure, you defanged Iraq, but at what cost? Is that a cost that Israel and others can live in the neighborhood with? In the case of Iran. And the third is Libya. And again, I think there are two parts to that discussion. Part of it was the grand bargain, the kind of issue in the deal. And maybe what you're absolutely right is we need to think of these three experiences and see if there's a sort of, common approach that we might want to develop, using elements of that, moving from one to the other. But, that requires a much greater degree of coordination between all of the actors and these approaches than we've seen at the moment. What we're sort of seeing is, you've got the military option, which has no correlation in some ways with, what should follow. And I think that's something that we need to sort of think through a little bit further and going forward. Shlomo and Emily, your question's absolutely spot on about, number one, the issue of the regime. Hypothetically speaking, counterfactual, if the Shah was around and if Iran was still in this capability, there wouldn't be this issue. And who knows, you may have a regime, again, where it may not be an issue. Not under the present, sort of turbans and beards, but, under other kind of setting. But the other question, Shlomo, that you raised, which is an important one, that, and this comes to the question of the grand bargain that you mentioned as well. What is the way of accommodating Iran and its interests in the broader region, right? Minus nuclear weapons. And this comes back to an issue of, okay, even if you have a different regime, and let's assume that we go down that direction, is there a kind of via media? And this is one of the reasons why I think the Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Zone Conference is useful if you can think and talk about some kind of a security architecture which may involve or, provide in the long run, it's not going to happen overnight, a certain degree of accommodation for Iran. And again, we heard, Iran's very great hesitation, even sort of surrounded in the Arab or the Sunni Sea, and to see how you might be able to accommodate that going forward, irrespective of everything else. And I think it's certainly worth considering. Thank you.
Fine, please.
Very short comments. We have to look at the overall picture. What is Iran doing? What are its tactics? The tactics are very simple. Iran is playing for time. Mm-hmm. It has been doing that for quite a few years and very, very successfully at that. And if we get into negotiations again with Iran, that will be again the case unless Iran is under terrible pressure from its own interests to go into negotiations. The situation is not there yet. They will go into any negotiations. They will take any options you're talking about, the Turkish-Brazilian one or whatever. They will not give you anything which will stop them, and they will certainly, at the present time, will not roll back. If you put these two simple facts into the equation, you see that you are not in a very good position. So you have to have the mix. I agree. You have to have very strong sanctions, and in the meantime, and not in a bombastic way, start talking to them and say, look, we are going forward in a very, very bad way. It can be done, but the pressure has to be very strong on them. We saw that with minimal pressure, nothing moves there. And one word about the regime change. You don't know into what it will change. I don't know the Greens. But if Rafsanjani, for instance, comes into force, well, he was a big proponent of the nuclear program. For a country to roll back, it has to have a really deep understanding that it is in its own interest to do that. And at the same time, the world has to accept, and certainly Iran is not Japan. Iran is really more like the DPRK, and that is probably what stands in front of us.
Yeah, I would address the two questions and perhaps the third one as well. I'll try to plunge into the perspective of dialoguing, so to say, with Iran. But your questions, in fact, are stemming from a very well-established Western school, meaning that we know our path, we know what to do, we know how to impose sanctions, we know that people have to pay a price for sanctions, and therefore it's a good path to follow with Iran. But this was not a good path to follow in Iraq, by the way. Iraq was for 12 years under sanctions, and by the end of it, the United States had to go to war. It didn't work. It didn't work, and it will not probably work in Iran, because the question is not just how much a people or a regime is ready to pay for having a nuclear power, but to ask also how much would it cost them for not having the nuclear power, meaning how would they relate to the threat that is around them? What is the perception of Iran of being intimidated and threatened? Because when Iran looks around or into its environment, it sees Pakistan with a nuclear weapon, it sees India with a nuclear weapon, it sees Israel with a nuclear weapon, it sees an American threat. And Iran says, well, it doesn't matter who runs Iran. We need nuclear weapons. And so said the Shah himself before the awful Ayatollah regime came over. So we have to change our perception, and we have to look into what Iran wants and what is the deal. And this is an answer also to your question. I think that we should read carefully what was written in Ahmadinejad's letter to President Bush. I think it was 2006 or so, where he had really spread out his ambition, so to say.
What is Iran? Iran is a superpower. Iran is a state that can solve problems in the region. Iran should be a partner to political endeavors with the West. And Iran should be at least considered as important as no less than Turkey, so to say. So, in this respect, we look into Iran only from the prospect of its capabilities. We don't try to understand its motivation. Meaning, yeah, we know perhaps how to deal with its capabilities. We can strike it, we can impose sanctions, we can do lots of stuff, but what is the real motivation behind having its nuclear weapons? And this, I saw very little analysis in the West, and quite a few in Iran itself, that declare and explain why should Iran have nuclear weapons. Now, I think that the major question is, and I refer to what Professor Scolei was saying, there isn't yet any political decision. Why isn't there any political decision in Iran? Why Khamenei has not decided yet? I mean, is it a window of opportunity for the West to say, well, let's see, maybe we can change the motivation, maybe we can play into the political arena rather than into the military arena, but this is not an option. Nobody speaks about it. I think that we should really change a little bit our perception and see that the dialogue with Iran is not to let it export carpets and I don't know, some peanut fistuks to the West, but to look into Iran as a major power in the area, the way we look to other major powers in the area like Turkey, perhaps like great powers in Eastern Asia, and to reconsider our whole approach towards Iran. Look how much we are threatened by it. So perhaps it's really good time to respect it a little further.
Thank you all. A short coffee break and we convene again in 15 minutes.